The Sydney River McDonald's, nestled on the busiest commercial strip in Cape Breton, was a beacon of normalcy. On the evening of May 9, 1992, its bright lights and familiar logo promised nothing more than cheap meals and a familiar routine. Inside, the closing shift was winding down. The last customers had left and the familiar rituals of a shutdown began. The smell of grease and disinfectant hung in the air as the grills were turned off and the final rounds of cleaning commenced. Donna, Warren, the 22-year-old shift manager, was a responsible and caring presence, focused on getting her crew home safely. Jimmy Fagan, at 27, was the older brother figure, known for his easygoing nature and quick wit. The three teenagers working alongside them represented the typical fabric of the community. Arlene McNeil, just 17, was a bright and popular high school student. Neil Burrows, 20, was quiet and reliable. The youngest was 16-year-old Peter Gillis, eager and good-natured, for whom this job was a first step into adulthood. They were counting cash, wiping surfaces, and sharing the light-hearted chatter of people anticipating the end of their workday. A radio might have been playing a top 40 hit. For them, it was just another Saturday night. The world outside the glass windows was dark and still, the traffic on the Prince Street Highway having quieted to an occasional passing car. There was no sense of impending doom, no shadow falling over the parking lot. They were in the most mundane of places, surrounded by the icons of childhood birthdays and family treats, utterly unaware that the ordinary was about to fracture. Beyond, the glow of the restaurant hidden by the night, three figures watched this routine play out. They observed the movements of the staff with a clinical interest, noting who was where and what they were doing. They were not professionals. They were nervous, their hearts likely pounding with a toxic mix of adrenaline and fear. But one among them moved with a chilling familiarity. Derek Wood knew the layout of the kitchen, the procedure for closing the safe, the exact location of the back door that was often left unlocked during cleanup. He had stood where Donna Warren now stood, had cleaned the same grills as Neil Burrows. His knowledge, once used for flipping burgers, was now the key to a very different plan. The betrayal was already in motion, silent and invisible to the 5 people inside who believed they were among friends in a safe town. The last shift was about to become their last shift, and the normalcy of the scene was the most terrifying disguise of all. The plan, in Derek Wood's mind, was foolproof. He had mapped it out, leveraging his insider knowledge of the restaurant's closing routine. The back door near the play area would be their point of entry. It was often unbolted during the final cleanup to take out the trash. The staff would be concentrated in the back, counting money and washing down equipment. They would be surprised, compliant, and easily controlled. The 3 young men, their faces hidden by balaclavas and their hands gripping a .22 caliber rifle and a 12-gauge shotgun, moved across the dark parking lot with a nervous urgency. The weapons felt heavy and alien, symbols of a violence that was still just a theoretical part of the plan. They slipped inside with an ease that must have felt like a sign of success. The familiar smell of the place, fries, grease, cleaning, solution, hit Derek, a bizarre contrast to the mission. They found the 5 employees exactly where Wood predicted they would be, in the back area near the offices and the cold storage. The initial shock was total. Confusion and then raw fear flashed across the faces of Donna, Jimmy, Arlene, Neil, and Peter. Orders were barked, harsh and guttural in the tense silence. The employees were forced to the floor, their hands bound behind their backs with plastic, zip ties. The robbers' movements were jittery, fueled by adrenaline. Money was being gathered from the safe, the metallic rustle of bills and clink of coins filling the air. For a few minutes, the heist was proceeding as intended. Then the unmistakable chime of the drive-through speaker echoed through the building. It was a mundane sound that suddenly became terrifying. Everyone froze. The customer's voice, tinny and impatient, crackled through the silence, asking if anyone was there. The robbers panicked, their carefully constructed plan instantly fragile. They held their breath, praying the customer would leave. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of a car driving away provided a temporary relief. But the damage was done. The delicate bubble of their controlled environment had been popped. The world had intruded, reminding them of the unpredictability of reality. The employees had now been captives for longer than anticipated. They had heard the panic in their captors' voices. Most catastrophically, despite the masks, Derek Wood's distinctive voice and mannerisms had been recognized. He was known to them. The crime was no longer anonymous. The original plan of a quick, clean, faceless robbery was dead. In its place grew a new, horrifying calculus. These were no longer just obstacles to a payday. They were witnesses who could identify them, who could ruin their lives. The money in the bag suddenly seemed insignificant, weighed against that threat. A silent, grim understanding passed between the three young men. The purpose of the night had just undergone a dark and irreversible shift. The decision, though likely, unspoken, settled over the three young men with a chilling finality. The abstract concept of murder now became a logistical problem to be solved. The original plan was ashes. What remained was the grim, methodical work of eliminating the threat. The employees, lying bound on the cold floor, could sense the shift in the atmosphere. The nervous energy of the robbers had hardened into something far more terrifying, a cold, purposeful resolve. The drive-through interruption had stolen their momentum, and in its place a monstrous calm descended. The executions began. One by one they were led from the larger group. There was no struggle, no last-minute plea that could penetrate the wall of their captors' desperation. The first to be taken was Jimmy Fagan. He was marched into the nearby washroom and shot in the back of the head with the .22 rifle. The sound, a sharp crack, was contained within the tiled room. Next was Donna Warren, the manager. She was led to the basement stairs and shot, her body falling onto the steps. The violence was swift and clinical, a brutal efficiency that spoke of a desire to simply complete the horrific task. Back in the main area, the remaining three teenagers, Arlene, Neil, and Peter, were paralyzed with terror. The sound of the gunshots, though muffled, was unmistakable. They knew now that this was not just about money. Arlene McNeil was the next to be taken. She was shot where she lay on the floor of the back room. The shooters then turned to Neil Burrows. He was shot in the head at point-blank range. The assailants, believing him to be dead, moved on. Finally, they focused on the youngest, Peter Gillis. He was forced to stand and walk into the large walk-in freezer. He was told to kneel on the cold, hard floor. The door swung shut, plunging him into darkness. A flashlight beam fixed on him, and a shotgun blast roared in the enclosed space, striking him in the head and neck. The killers believed their work was done. They had silenced all 5 witnesses. In a final, callous act, they stepped over and around the bodies of their former friends and co-workers to gather the money from the open safe. The sum was pitifully small for the price that had been paid. They slipped back out the same door they had entered, disappearing into the Nova Scotia night, leaving behind a scene of utter carnage. The cheerful, brightly colored restaurant, with its posters of happy meals and smiling celebrities, was now a tomb. The silence that returned was absolute, broken only by the hum of the freezers and a faint, agonizing sound. The shallow, ragged breath of Neil Burrows, who, against all odds, was still conscious. And from within the dark freezer, another miracle. Peter Gillis, though grievously and painfully wounded, was also alive. The killer's rush to escape had prevented them from ensuring their shots were fatal. Their most critical mistake had been made. They had left living witnesses. The first police officers on the scene were met with a stillness that felt wrong. The silence of a usually bustling restaurant at that hour was expected, but this was different. A heavy, ominous quiet. Then they found the first body, and the second. The scale of the violence quickly became apparent, a massacre that defied logic. The initial assumption pointed toward a professional hit, a gangland-style execution. The community's fear was immediate and palpable. Parents kept their children closer, and people glanced nervously at strangers, wondering if the killers were still among them, hidden in plain sight. The idea that this was the work of local boys was unimaginable. The brutality suggested monsters, not neighbors. The breakthrough came from the hospital. Neil Burrows, clinging to life after a bullet had carved a devastating path through his brain, was fighting. He was paralyzed, unable to speak, but his mind was acutely aware. Detectives, desperate for any lead, hovered by his bedside. They asked yes or no questions, watching for the faintest movement in his eyes or fingers. It was painstaking, heartbreaking work. Slowly, haltingly, he managed to communicate. He confirmed there were 3 attackers, and then he provided a name. It wasn't a stranger, it was a name they knew: Derek Wood. The revelation was staggering. The investigation pivoted in an instant. The monsters had names and addresses. The police moved quickly. They began surveilling Wood along with his known associates Darren Muse and Freeman McNeil. The 3 were trying to act normal, but the pressure was an invisible weight crushing them from the inside. They were watching the news, seeing the outpouring of grief and anger, hearing the descriptions of the manhunt. Their bravado began to fracture. The first to break was the youngest, Darren Muse. The psychological burden became too immense to bear alone. He confessed the entire horrific story to his father, his words a torrent of guilt and terror. His father, faced with an impossible choice, made the right one. He drove his son to the RCMP detachment. Moose's detailed confession was the key that unlocked the entire case. With Moise in custody and talking, the net snapped shut. Derek Wood was arrested at his home. Freeman McNeil, perhaps realizing the futility of resistance, was apprehended without incident. The town's collective shock deepened. These weren't shadowy figures from away, they were local kids. People who had sat in the same classrooms, shopped at the same stores, and indeed eaten at that same McDonald's. The fear of the unknown was now replaced by a profound sense of betrayal. The community was left to grapple with a new, more disturbing question. How could we have not known? The evil hadn't arrived from the outside. It had been nurtured silently within their midst, and it wore the familiar face of the boy next door. The trials that followed were not about establishing guilt. The evidence was overwhelming. Instead, they became a painful public autopsy of the crime, revealing the chilling mechanics of the betrayal and the sheer cowardice that followed. Derek Wood, in a desperate bid to save himself, turned crown witness. He took the stand against his friends, painting himself as a coerced victim, a reluctant participant forced to comply by the threats of McNeil and Mose. His performance was cold and calculated, a detailed recitation of the night's events devoid of any discernible remorse. He described the shootings with a clinical detachment that was more horrifying than any outburst of emotion could have been. The jury saw through it. They saw the architect of the plan trying to evade its consequences. But the most powerful testimony, the testimony that truly sealed their fates, came from the one witness they believed they had silenced. Peter Gillis, having endured a miraculous recovery from wounds that should have killed him, walked into the courtroom. His presence was a profound shock to the defendants, and a moment of stunning gravity for everyone present. He was a living testament to their failure. With unwavering clarity, Peter identified Freeman McNeil as the man who led him into the freezer, who told him to kneel, and who fired the shotgun that tore into his body. His account was simple, direct, and utterly devastating. It was the final, undeniable proof of their intent to kill, demolishing any fabricated narrative of a robbery that had simply spiraled out of control. All 3 were convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years, the most severe punishment available under Canadian law. The verdicts provided a measure of legal closure, but no sense of victory. The community was left with a permanent scar and unanswerable questions about the nature of evil. The story's most haunting twist was not found in the details of the crime, but in its aftermath. It was the resilience of Neil Burrows, who learned to communicate and live a life of incredible strength despite his devastating injuries. It was the courage of Peter Gillis, who faced his would-be killer in court and spoke the truth. The legacy of the Sydney River McDonald's massacre is not just one of senseless death, but also of 2 young men who refused to be erased, whose survival ensured that the full truth would be known and that justice, however imperfect, would be served.